Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? It's steamy Wednesday here in Minnesota, in the upper Midwest of the North American continent. It's midsummer and we're feeling it. That's all right though. It's either going to be cold or hot in this place. So, hope you all enjoyed that last few episodes. Appreciate all the comments and feedback again from people. And one of the best comments I got was on the Norman Grands. I didn't even recognize a lot of people weren't going to really know that name. I forget kind of how not commonplace some of these names are. And so when I post a video about a Norman Grands at the Philharmonic, it's easy for me to have that same disconnect. Because I remember thinking for the longest time myself that Philharmonic, this must be classical or classical mixed with jazz at best. And I shied away from it for a long time because of that. And a guy commented that same thing on my video. It's like, that makes sense. And so I need to maybe somehow better serve you guys by explaining what a video is going to be. I guess I've always kind of hoped people would just check it out anyway. But I know time is precious and it's hard always to find the time to sit down and watch a guy ramble on about jazz for 20 minutes to an hour. But today we're going to talk about a series of records that I feel need to be reissued. I think there's some big gaps in the marketplace today. And what we're envisioning here is a Tone Poet-like reissue series for my fictitious reissue label, Jazz Shepherd Records. And I'm going to present it like this is a series of records that are going to be reissued. They're going to be loosely connected sets, usually from a specific label, that I think these records have things in common that would make them a nice package to be reissued. There's a lot of great specimens and volunteers for this mission. So many great little labels have so little available in the marketplace today. And we're going to try to dive into as many of those labels as possible, as long as people are interested and want to keep watching this. And hopefully some of this stuff does get reissued at some point. And we're going to start off today by talking about Bethlehem. And I've done a little bit of researching on Amazon and Discogs and trying to figure out what is available from Bethlehem right now. And over the years, I know the Johnny Hartman stuff has been reissued a few times. They weren't that expensive, so I don't know how they were digital sourced or what. I do see this Dexter Gordon is available right now, along with the Charlie Mingus record and the Motor City record and the Booker Irvin record. And I've also seen a Nina Simone, one of her LPs on Bethlehem, seems to be in print right now. The problem being with some of that is that the Dexter stuff is a 4 or 5 grouping of colored vinyl reissues that I was looking at. And the Booker Irvin, the Motor City guys, all from Detroit, of course, the Mingus, those records, while they are on Bethlehem technically, aren't very much Bethlehem sessions. I think the Dexter Gordon actually was recorded by Gus Wilde in Bethlehem, but even on that I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure, especially based on who the sidemen are, it feels like that's something that Bethlehem undertook. But that other stuff that they're reissuing there, it's from when King bought Bethlehem and other small labels as well. And then they started repackaging stuff with different covers under the Bethlehem name, but they weren't Bethlehem sessions. And so of the 4 or 5 records that I see are available right now from Bethlehem, only the Nina Simone and the Dexter Gordon are actually Bethlehem sessions that give you a clue as to what Bethlehem sounds like and is about. And I think that's a problem, because the Bethlehem label and legacy is far more important than it's given credit for today. It's one of the premier labels of the early to mid 50s. And racial disregard doesn't matter. This was a really important label. And remember, the white labels were selling far better than the black labels, just from sheer financial availability to buy records, the size of the marketplace. It was a very different dynamic for a Bethlehem versus a Blue Note. And you could put Bethlehem records with their great sharp covers and their white musicians and all the college towns and campuses across the country, and those records would sell. And that certainly wasn't the case for the little black labels. Their distribution challenges were much more difficult. But Gus Wilde was the founder of Bethlehem. A little background here. They're kind of not sure what their focus is going to be. They have some kind of poppier stuff, so R&B like stuff. We're talking late 40s, early 50s. Most of it's all 7-inch at this point. And it's a young Creed Taylor who makes his start at Bethlehem, convincing Gus Wilde he's a record producer when he's none of that at all. He just has the will and the drive to be a record producer, but he didn't have any of this technical ability or know-how. Yet somehow he had enough money and business sense that the guy sticks in the jazz industry for decades and reshapes a lot of what happens in jazz at Impulse, Verve, CTI. It's a pretty amazing legacy, Creed Taylor. But he was instrumental in convincing Gus to go into a jazz format. They bring Chris Connor in. They have some success with the Chris Connor. They end up releasing a couple 10 inches by her. And it's popular enough that they decide to go down that road. And thankfully, that's exactly what they did. They start recording East Coast talent from around the New York tri-state area. And they're doing some fine recordings, modern recordings, post-bop recordings. But they recognized at one point there was a gap to be filled. So they opened up a West Coast branch, an office, and start signing unsigned talent in the West Coast big bands. And by this point, the big band era has really come to a screeching halt. And only the most successful, popular bands, the Benny Goodmans, Ellington and Basie, Woody Herman, Stan Kenton, are even attempting to do large band stuff. And Kenton and Herman have pretty popular groups based out of Los Angeles, and they're attracting some of the best talent in the country out to Los Angeles. And it's important to remember that there's a second Great Migration in America. After the Great Migration from the South, of all the black Americans up into the north, into the industrial cities of the north looking for employment, there was a post-war second migration of partially what's considered white flight, but it was also dictated by economic circumstances. The great manufacturing power of the American heartland and the Rust Belt was being crippled by this new post-war global opportunity that corporations had to produce goods cheaper elsewhere. The unions were a hindrance. The environmental regulations were a hindrance. The taxation was a hindrance. The new American empire post-war had opened up a lot of foreign lands to economic interests and endeavors. The American corporations, the global corporations, now had all these new places where they could perform their manufacturing. And it led to a real dearth of jobs in the heartland and in the industrial Rust Belt. And even the jobs that the blacks that came up for were no longer available as factories started to shut down. And this is already starting in the 50s, but it gets worse and worse at the end of the 60s and the 70s. So there's a second great migration in this country of white Americans out of the East Coast, out of the Rust Belt, to the South where the blacks had just left. Don't be misconstrued, though. There's still plenty of blacks in the South. All you have to do is look at any SEC football roster and to see how many blacks still live in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia. But a lot of whites start going back down south or moving there to places like Nashville, of course Atlanta, the home of the South, Florida. So they're moving south, but they're also moving west. And the westward expansion of America, it was a big task, a big continent. And for Europeans, like going from New York to LA is like going from Catalonia, Spain to Moscow. It's a long way. You're going across a lot of terrain. There's a huge mountain range in the way. And the interstates are finally kind of coming into place, making that cross-country drive doable. Airplanes are changing travel as well, and the time it takes to get from coast to coast. So there's this great movement to the West Coast. And so a lot of these young kids that are out there playing in the most cutting-edge modern groups available, Woody Herman and Stan Kenton, came from Philadelphia. Stan Levy, great Philadelphian drummer, who worked with Dizzy Gillespie and Parker very early on. The great Charlie Mariano comes from Boston, but makes it out on the West Coast. The Williamson brothers are from Vermont, and they make it out to the West Coast and are part of that great scene. Conte Condoli, I think, was Detroit, if I remember. Max Bennett, I think, was a New Yorker. Frank Rosalino was a Detroiter. So these guys are all from these East Coast places, moving out to this new West Coast as this metropolis is growing and sprawling, and these bands are still hanging on, still making a living. If you get into those bands, you're going to be winners of the Downbeat polls and the Playboy polls, because that's the people that were exposed to those people who voted in those magazines. And so it was still drawing the young talent, especially in white American jazz, out to the West Coast. But most of these guys were performing under the heading of Herman and Kenton. What's his name? I just saw the other day. Claude Thornhill. He had a big band that was on the West Coast doing some things, and had some people coming in and out of his lineups. But they were all kind of chomping at the bit to do more than these big group ensembles, to do more than swing. And of course, some of that Kenton stuff was very modern, almost edges of the avant-garde at times, very compositional, very structured, to the point of rigidity at times. It's very modern, but it's also very lacking in the freedom and lacking the blues. And make no mistake about it, these young players knew what was happening in jazz. They weren't just sitting back going, we're going to be influenced by the past. They wanted to very much be current with what was happening in the jazz scene. And they've even moved past bebop at this point, even though they all kind of dabbled in bebop. But there's a young guy by the name of Clifford Brown who's been on the West Coast at times. He's doing recordings and concerts for Gene Norman on the GNP label. He does some recordings for Pacific Records, the Jazz Immortal series. Clifford Brown's making waves. And he's not just stirring the pot in the black jazz community, he's crossing over and stirring the pot in the white jazz community. So these kids in LA are hearing Clifford and Max and that incredible quintet. And the cutting edge in jazz in 53, 54 was exactly that. Bebop was already being passed over for this new, more melodic, but hard-driving, groove-filled hard bop. And hard bop's still really not come on the scene yet. It's kind of being codified by Clifford Brown and Max Roach Quintet. Like, they're the real precursor of the hard bop sound. And one of the things about Clifford Brown is, like Charlie Parker, his innovations were so dynamic, in part because he made them accessible and never abandoned melody. You slow Parker down, he's always still playing melodic phrasings that are hummable and vocal-like. Parker was a great lyricist and vocalist through his horn. It wasn't just notes as fast as you could without any semblance of organization or melodic structure. They were always played in a beautiful way. And Clifford Brown comes along and kind of is doing that same thing. He's playing at such a tempo with such a ferocity and a violence of emotion that's very controlled and very precise, melodically centered, big, full, sharp, like round notes. Brownie really is changing the landscape. And like I was saying, he's kind of creating hard bop, somewhat unintentional. I don't think it was necessarily his desire to create a new subgenre probably any one of them was Parker's desire to create bebop. Parker was just able to do this stuff from endless rehearsal, endless melodic ideation, and just throwing things out there that that other people had to put a name on. Like whatever that guy's doing, that's really cool. And most of the imitators of Parker forgot about the melody, forgot about the structure of harmonics and melodic forward thinking in the music. And Parker never was about abandoning that in any way. And hard bop kind of reestablishes the song structure with playing the original head of the music so people know what you're doing. And then it's more melodic than most of what was happening in bebop at the time. So these young Bethlehem kids were being signed as leaders to play on the Bethlehem label for the West Coast office. And they were all familiar with each other, and they all kind of play on each other's records. And I could do a couple other sets on Bethlehem that are worthy of reissue, and I probably will if the series goes any length of time. But right now we're going to focus on Bethlehem and the West Coast stuff. And I've talked about it numerous times, so that anyone who's been watching this channel for a couple of years has heard me talk about Bethlehem and the West Coast kids. However, my label, Jazz Shepherd Records, is going to reissue 18 Bethlehem West Coast classics that will really round out what this label was offering in 1953, 54, and 55. And let there be no mistake about it. What these young kids were doing in imitating Clifford Brown with that tempo and that velocity and that high level of dynamic tension and volume. These guys are playing at full tilt. And it's clear that the modern jazz context ignores what Bethlehem was doing, because Bethlehem in a lot of ways in 54, 55 is on the cutting edge. And that was true for the white musicians in the cool scene in the early 50s. It was true with the white musicians in Birth of the Cool. The white musicians were able to be very innovative, often had very good schooling behind them and the best instruments and the best recording studios. So it wasn't shocking that a lot of times innovation was led by the white leaders of the music, especially when they were being impacted and influenced by the great black players of the time. And I don't think there's any mistake that these guys were hearing Clifford Brown's group. And we have to remember that Blue Note in 54, 55 is still searching for its sound. It doesn't have it yet. The Blue Note hard bop sound really doesn't come into shape until 56, into 57, 58, 59. That's when Blue Note really becomes the cutting edge of the music, with a far more aggressive, socially, politically charged version of hard bop. And that's not present in the Clifford Brown stuff necessarily, and it's not present in the white hard bop stuff, which I've recoined as cool bop. Because it's not cool. These guys are playing tempo at incredible speed, and very few people would be able to discern between these guys and the great black hard boppers of the day. So Bethlehem was actually kind of ahead of Riverside Records, ahead of Savoy, that's kind of become a dinosaur. Blue Note's not established yet. Impulse is years off in the future. The West Coast labels are kind of doing the cool stuff. They haven't really branched into cool bop yet. The Howard Rumseys and the Shelly Manns. You know what I mean? And some of that stuff's pretty hard swinging cool bop as well, Shelly Mann's groups, and even the Howard Rumsey stuff. But and some of these guys actually played with Rumsey at times. But there's a special extra edge to the ferocity of what these young kids are doing at Bethlehem, giving this license to burn. As leaders on these records, there's no oversight from Stan Kenton, from Woody Herman, from Claude Thornhill. There's no oversight from a label trying to make something that's very accessible. They're making, in no unfettered terms here, the blackest jazz white kids can make. And it's incredible stuff. And so Bethlehem deserves this reissue, not just because of I love these records, which I do. I hold Bethlehem dear. And I feel like I'm probably one of the living experts on Bethlehem at this time, having the whole volume of their body of work. Coming up, learning Bethlehem, there wasn't a lot of resources for me to learn about the Bethlehem story. And if I was to write a book on what I knew about Bethlehem, it wouldn't be a very long book. A lot of it's just insight from having it. You can't find a picture of Gus Wilde anywhere. You look at a picture of Gus Wilde, you'll probably find a picture of Sid Nathan from King Records, who ends up buying Bethlehem in 1959-60 or whatever that was. And so the Bethlehem story is an untold story in a lot of ways. And yet they were a very important label helping to change the course of the music at that time. And so there's a validity historically to these records being reissued. And you'll have a hard time finding in 54, aside from Clifford Brown's work, other records that are as hard driving and as full of the hard bop sound and condition as these young white kids at Bethlehem. So that being said, the history behind us, the understanding of the label's import, let's take a quick look now at the 18 choices I made. And there's a few other records that are kind of on the periphery of this grouping, and I don't think that everyone's going to be 18. I think we're going to let this be a case-by-case reissue program. But we're going to do this in 3 groups of 6, okay? And we're going to have these 3 groups of 6 released in 6-month increments. And so what that's going to mean is in the Christmas of this year, we're going to release the first 6 of these. Spring of the following year, we'll do the next 6. And then Thanksgiving of the next year, we'll do of 2023, the following 6 will come out. And keep in mind, this is all fictional and DreamWorks. But we're allowed to dream. We're allowed to imagine what this reissue program would look like. And being that this is at that crossover point from the 10-inch era into the 12-inch era, we're going to have both formats in this series of reissues. And we want to keep it true to the original releases. So we're going to do these as 10-inch and 12-inch. And each set of 6 will have 2 10-inches and 4 12-inch LPs. I want another important aspect of this to be the lacquered covers. Bethlehem was leading the music industry in graphic design in 53, 54, 55. There's no one really even in competition, aside from maybe Roost, who had the same graphic designer, Burt Goldblatt. Goldblatt's such an innovative designer, and the graphic work that he presents changes the music industry, not just the jazz industry. Goldblatt's work is seminal. I've done an episode on his work. It's very collectible stuff. You see a Burt Goldblatt cover, it's worth it just for the cover. It's fantastic design. It maintains a lot of modernity, elegance, sophistication, great photography, some line drawings that will borrow somewhat from David Stone Martin, who we just talked about at the Jazz at the Philharmonic, who worked for Clef and Norman Granz. But the 3 main graphic designers you're going to come across in jazz that were kind of leading the pack was David Stone Martin, who's doing kind of a traditional line drawing, almost old world feeling graphic look. Then you have Reed Miles, who comes along at Blue Note, but Reed doesn't really get into the swing of things at Blue Note until probably 56. None of the 10-inch covers, or maybe a few of the 10-inch on Blue Note, were Reed Miles. Just maybe a couple, if any. And all the early 12-inch LPs of Blue Note weren't Reed Miles, although some of them got reissued with a Reed Miles cover, like the Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. One last point I want to make about Blue Note. When you look at Blue Note in 54, 55, 56, the only real established artist that's going to maintain their place at Blue Note and be a part of the hard bop canon in that era is really Horace Silver. He's the part of the Jazz Messengers, gone off on his own with Hank Mobley and Doug Watkins, and then he ends up having Junior Cook and Blue Mitchell in his group for a long time. Silver is kind of Blue Note's hard bop champion in the mid-50s. Blakey is doing a few live recordings that Blue Note's licensed, but Blakey's not under contract to Blue Note yet. In spite of those live records of the Bohemian and Birdland that are in that era, Blakey's all over the place with who he's working for, labeled contractually wise. And in 54, 55, 56, he's actually at Columbia with that great first messenger group with Silver, Watkins, and Bird and Mobley. But it's the legacy of Bethlehem that we're talking about here. And so many great records that are ahead of their time were put out in this small window. And they come quickly and they depart just as fast. And by the time Bethlehem has switched over to the 6000 series, none of these artists are anymore at Bethlehem. By the time King is reissuing stuff, all that stuff sounds very different from this Bethlehem sound from this mid-50s moment. That being said, let's jump into my first 6. So in Christmas of this year, we're going to get these two 10 inches by the fantastic Conti Condoli. As you can see, I've taken the plastic sleeves off these so you can really appreciate the beautiful artwork. This is by the great Max Bennett, a fantastic bass player who in this moment was making some of the best hard-driving jazz on bass on the West Coast, ends up in the Wrecking Crew and ends up on hundreds if not thousands of recordings as a bass player, mostly playing electric bass. But here he's part of this fantastic assemblage. And again, great covers, numbers 1016 and 1028. And we have Conti Condoli here on the trumpet, who's a fantastic trumpet player with lots of fire, bright sound, really could cut glass with his tone. With Stan Levy from Philly on drums, Max Bennett's on the bass, and the great Claude Williamson's on the piano. And again, we're going to see a very kind of redundant lineups here in a lot of ways, even though they expand from quartets to sextets and septets even at times. This is a sextet by the looks of it, with Max Bennett, Charlie Mariano, Stan Levy, Claude Williamson, Frank Rosalino on the trombone, with the great Helen Carr singing a couple tracks. And some of her recordings will have some of these guys on them as well. For the 4 12-inch LPs in our first set, we're going to start with Bethlehem number 25 from 1955, Charlie Mariano. And it's just a self-titled BCP 25. Great gold black cover. Still very, you can still see this on a record today. And again, on this one, we're featuring a quartet with Max Bennett, John Williams on piano, which is a bit of a departure, and Mel Lewis on the drums. So not quite the same lineup there, but Mariano is such a force. The number 31 is Stu Williamson plays. Stu and Claude were two brothers from Vermont who made their way initially to Boston, I think, to play with Serge Chaloff and Charlie Mariano. And then they all kind of went out west and worked out there together. He's working with Stan Kenton and the Stan Kenton Presents. And he actually records long into the 70s, if not the 80s. Stu's a great player. On this record, he's playing in a quintet setting. Great cover, by the way. With Claude Williamson, with Charlie Mariano, Max Bennett, and Stan Levy. So again, you have that same kind of grouping of guys. And then we have the drummer, Stan Levy, out of Philly. And he's, again, making leadership on this record. The drum's on me. You can see his feet sticking out of the drum cases. A great burnt gold black cover. And he's playing here in a sextet with the fantastic Dexter Gordon as a sideman here in 55. Conti Condoli's on the trumpet, cutting glass. Frank Rosalino, one of the most dexterous trombone players this side of Jimmy Cleveland, with Leroy Vinegar on the bass and Lou Levy on the piano. So again, there's a few names there that are not as common to the grouping. And then number 54, Claude Williamson. This is in a trio setting by the looks of it, with Don Prell on the bass and Chuck Flores on the drums from 1956 in Hollywood. Another great album cover. And so that's the first 6 coming out this Christmas. Now in late spring of 2023, our next 6 are going to be reissued. And boy, I think these all just need to be on the market. This is Charlie Mariano, 10-inch, beautiful gold-black imagery of an X-ray of a saxophone. Just beautiful modernity there. And again, Charlie's such a great tenor sax player. plays the alto a lot of the times, actually. He marries Toshiko Akiyoshi, the Japanese pianist, and they play together for quite a long time. This has Stu Williamson, Claude Williamson, Frank Rosalino, Max Bennett, Stan Levy. Fantastic driving, hard bop, cool bop. Fantastic stuff. And then we're going to do Stu Williamson's Sapphire, another beautiful cover, beautiful photography of ocean waves lapping up on the shore. And this is a quintet with Charlie Mariano, Stu Williamson with his brother Claude, Max Bennett on the bass, and Stan Levy. So those will be the 2 10-inches from next spring. And then along with those 2 10-inches will be these 4 LPs. Claude Williamson's Round Midnight. And again, Claude's such a great player on the piano. This is again a trio setting with Red Mitchell on the bass, who does some work at Bethlehem as a leader. And then the great Mel Lewis, one of the West Coast legends, who works with Thad Jones for a long time in that grouping together. Again, T for 2 is fantastic, Cellar by Starlight. He does a lot of standards here that will really tickle your eardrums. And these are the only 2 I have that are not original pressings of these. These are both fresh sound pressings that Spain issued in the 80s, if I remember. This is Stan Levy's second roll album as a leader on Bethlehem, number 71, towards the end of the BCP series. And here we find him in a sextet. Yep. With Conte Condoli again on the trumpet. Rigi Kamuka on the tenor. Fantastic tenor player. Played with the Woody Herman group. Was a part of that, the Woody Herman herd, and what was the grouping of the tenor players called? The Four Brothers. Frank Rosalino on the trombone. Sonny Clark's on the piano on this one. And Leroy Vinnegar's on the bass. And remember, Sonny Clark was on the West Coast for a while, even though he was a Pittsburgh native. They move out to LA, and he spends a number of years early developing on the West Coast scene before he comes back out east and helps reshape the Blue Note sound. But on a record like this, you can hear Sonny Clark's impact even on these guys. And then we're going to talk about Frank Rosalino. This is BCP 26, 1955. Again, fantastic modern artwork by Burt Goldblatt. Just a thrilling grouping of records here. Frank Rosalino, Sonny Clark once again, Willie Middlebrooks on the bass, Stan Levy on the drums, recorded in May of 56. So it's a great quartet there. And then the last one we're going to issue here for next spring is Max Bennett. This is one of his 12 inches, number BCP 48. And here he's playing in a 7, a septet. And he's got some interesting players on this one with Carl Fontana, one of the great trombone players, who does too much work outside of jazz, I think, to be recognized as the great jazz player that he was. The great Mel Lewis on the drums, Dave McKenna on the piano, a fine player who gets kind of forgotten about, Charlie Mariano, Jack Nimitz is on the baritone sax, and then Nick Travis is on the trumpet. And Travis was a great player in the big bands that didn't get a lot of work as a leader. The few things he does do at RCA are pretty fantastic. A great little trumpet player. So that's going to be the last of that second group of 6. And then, like I said, in the fall Thanksgiving era of 2023, we're going to put out these last group of 6. And the 2 10-inches will be consisting of Stan Levy, which is number 1017, 54. They're playing the compositions of Bob Cooper, Bill Holman, and Jimmy Joffrey. All 3 of those are real West Coast, compositionally driven players. Joffrey's already kind of experimenting with edges of the avant-garde. Here they're playing those guys' music with the band consisting of Zut Sims, Jimmy Joffrey, Conte Candoli, Max Bennett, and Claude Williamson. So, extreme edges of modernity, great cover. Just Lightning Bug's fantastic on this, West Coasting. I mean, these are just records that people need to be aware of. The last 10-inch in this series is called Wigville, and it's led by Russ Garcia. And Russ Garcia is more of an arranger and a band leader, and he actually leads the Wigville band and they back a few singers, and they have a few records of their own. But he borrows heavily from his Bethlehem roster mates to fill out his bands at times. And on this one, he's got Charlie Mariano, Pete Condoli, Conti Condoli, Max Bennett, Stan Levy, along with Bill Holman, Jimmy Joffrey, and a guy by the name of Russ Cheever on soprano sax. This is fantastic stuff. Great cover, real modern, and worthy of being part of this series. Max Bennett plays. This is his third release, second LP at Bethlehem. This is number 50. This has Max Bennett with Charlie Mariano, Frank Rosalino, and Carl Fontana, and Claude Williamson, and Stan Levy and Helen Carr appears on a song or two on that as well. Here's the third Charlie Mariano in this grouping. What a great cover that is with the microphone. This is BCP 49, probably 1956. And we got Stu Williamson, Frank Rosalino, Claude Williamson, Max Bennett, Stan Levy, and sometimes Mel Lewis on the drums. So again, just great groupings of players, great levels of ferocity, and accomplished players, man. Conti Condoli, this is his record as a leader, as an LP. He did have the 10-inch as well. And Toot Sweet's fantastic. And this has Conti with Bill Holman, Lou Levy, Lawrence Marble, and Leroy Vinegar. And with Marble and Vinegar, you're getting kind of a contemporary lineup there. Bill Holman, Lou Levy. But still, he's a great player, and he plays with these guys on so many of their records. And it's also a fantastic album cover as well. And last but not least is this Stu Williamson fantastic gold black cover once again. I think this one's like quintet, sextet. Looks like it's even a septet at times. Recorded in January of '56 in Hollywood, with Mariano, Holman, Jimmy Joffrey playing baritone, Stu Williamson, Claude Williamson, Leroy Vinegar, and Mel Lewis. And so those 18 Bethlehem records are going to be the pride and joy of my reissue series for Jazz Shepherd Records. And remember, this is a fictitious thing, but I'm hoping that someone watching will be like, man, that was interesting, and I would like to see that be done. This deserves an honorable mention. Peggy Connolly, this is a fantastic record. She's an actress, a cute little West Coast gal, and she makes this record for Bethlehem in probably '56, and it's got the Wigville Band backing her. Again, you got Condoli, Stu Williamson, Max Bennett, Stan Levy, Mariano, Cheevers, Jimmy Joffrey, Bill Holman. So a lot of the same musicians are backing her on this, and that will help give you some indication of what that music's going to sound and look like. However, I'm not making her part of this series because I do want to do a Bethlehem series on their vocalists. One of the last thing I want to mention is the Bethlehem inner record logo is one of the most beautiful in the jazz canon. It's got that gorgeous red color, and it's got that lovely little the leaf up top there. And just a real standout, fantastic label. Promo copy stamped right on that one. That's the Max Bennett Volume 2. But they're just gorgeous. You'll love Bethlehem for so many reasons. That little wreath is going to be one of the things you're going to love about collecting old Bethlehems. But with this reissue series, we're going to be putting in people's hands a lot of the great Bethlehem work. And so that wraps up this episode on the first Jazz Shepherd Records reissue program, the Bethlehem West Coast stuff. Those 18, those 6/10-inch, and those 12 LPs are all very noteworthy, worthy candidates of being added to the modern collector's scope. And that's what this series is going to try to do. We're going to try to add titles that I think have historical importance and relevance and are missing from today's discussion. And without any question, Bethlehem is being underserviced and undervalued. Even that Mingus stuff, there's a whole series of stuff that comes to Bethlehem in 55, 56. They reissue a lot of it in the BCP series in the 50s into the 60s in there somewhere. And it's all period jazz. Leonard Feather that Bethlehem takes ownership of. And again, you're not getting Bethlehem doing Bethlehem. So when you see these reissue records with the Motor City guys and the record I was just talking about, you're not getting the Booker River, and that wasn't a Bethlehem session. You know what I mean? These are Bethlehem records. That's the Bethlehem sound. And they're cutting edge for a good 2 years. They're doing some of the best stuff on the jazz market and playing their butts off. Every one of those records I've listened to numerous times. And I've come to know the Bethlehem canon as well as the Blue Note canon in some ways. And I just love a lot of what Bethlehem had to do. And I want these reissues to have gorgeous lacquered covers like the Tone Poet. I don't know if there's enough photographs out there to do the gatefolds. It'd be lovely if there was. And most importantly, I want the price point to be $24 to $30. Because I think if you can get these records out there nicely done with the original artwork, a nicely sourced audio, source, and you make them affordable, $24, $30. The most expensive stores sell them for $32, $33. They will sell. And once this were to happen, all the YouTube channels start talking about them and promoting them. Next thing you know, everyone's clamoring to get these releases. Just remember, you heard it here first. The Jazz Shepherd Records reissue program. So that's the format we're going to try to do on this. We're going to try to present it like it's an actual reissue series. And boy, if someone were to latch onto that and do it, throw me a few bucks. Give me my royalty. I put the work in, all playing aside. I'd love to see these records get out there for people. And they're very easy to listen to, like a Blue Note session. Hard driving, still with melodic phrasing. Great, absolutely fiery improvising and soloing. These guys are coming from the Clifford Brown school. The best of the best played with Kenton and Herman. I mean, you didn't get into those groups by being average Joe. You had to really shine to take the shoes of whoever just went on to go do their own thing. If you're taking the first chair in the Herman saxophone grouping or in the Stan Kenton Orchestra, you had to have some chops. And so these guys were hungry young kids, just at the cusp of their ability, finding what was cutting edge in this music. And I'm going to say it, even though I know it's going to make a few people cringe. They're playing as black as they know how. This is really fantastic stuff. They're throwing it down. They're improvising. The only thing that's missing is that same element of soul and struggle, because their experience isn't the same. And it's not about skin color, as I've said many times. It's just about the experiences of that skin color. None of the struggle or ability of the blacks has anything to do with being black. It just happens to be in black in this circumstance here in America. So, that being said, hope you guys enjoyed that. Give me your comments. Would you guys purchase these records? If every YouTube channel was out there saying, this is the best reissue series of the year coming out, Jazz Shepherd Records, Bethlehem Reissue West Coast Program. If every channel was spewing that stuff, that doctrine, they would create a marketplace and a market share, and they would sell. That's what I'm coming to realize, is that with this melee of voices out there, all trying to be heard, it's hard for a tone poet to fail. It's hard for any of these reissues to not do well because there's too many people advertising for free. And so, reissued people, I think Universal is under controlling of the Bethlehem sound. I would have loved to have played some Bethlehem in this episode, but nothing gets my shit taken down faster than playing Bethlehem music. Universal, I think it is just snakes about it. They're like, no monetization, or they actually don't get muted. So, hope y'all dug that. We'll come back at you with some other stuff soon on this series. I got another cool thing I'm working on with Jean-Michel. We'll probably have that for you in a week or so. We want people to keep learning. because I continue to keep learning, and everything I learn, I want to share with you guys. That's the joy of this channel. Is I'm doing a lot of the digging myself for y'all. All you gotta do is pick it up. Pick up the seeds I'm laying down, and watch your love and connection with this music grow. So I think for me, that was the real key. Is when I started to hear the music like I do, it started to become so much more important and magical, and my enjoyment really increased. Fantastic stuff. Talk to y'all soon. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. Give us a thumbs up. And if you want to support the channel, please go to my Patreon page and pledge a few bucks a month. I've lost a few patrons this month, which normal course of activity, it's understandable. People will pledge for a few months, then move on. I have no issue with that. But I could use a few new patrons just to get my income back to where it was, because I help use that to pay my bills right now. But coffee shop's moving forward, so hopefully we'll have that income coming in shortly as well. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Jazz Shepherd, blessings to you. Peace.